Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Unless you're reading some William Burroughs crazy trippy book or watching Legend of the Overfiend, in which case fiction is definitely trumping truth in the strangeness stakes, and we're all the more glad for it. Let's put giant naked bug orgies and tentacles aside for now though, and place our feet firmly in reality, or at least reality as it exists for an increasingly scary proportion of the population. Conspiracy theories, once the preserve of paranoid tinfoil hatters on a cloistered corner of the web, have, in the post-truth era, become a mainstream tool of coercion. You're more likely than ever to find that the average bloke on the street believes in shadowy conglomerates are pulling the strings behind everything from 9/11 to the Super Bowl success of the New England Patriots. Perhaps scarier still is that some of those frenzied fever dream ramblings about the Illuminati and secret government activities are totally right. For decades, the idea that the US government was spying on its own people, and plenty of other countries' citizens too, was dismissed as crazy talk, a Big Brother-style conspiracy that couldn't possibly be true. And then Edward Snowden served us all up a sizable helping of humble pie, which we were struggling to force down our gullets. Throughout human history, there's been dozens, if not hundreds, of crackpots cooking up their own conspiracies about events at every level of government and culture, and for the most part they don't have anything on all the dodgy stuff that's really been going on, right beneath our noses, without our knowledge. And here are just some of the craziest conspiracies that happen to be true. I am Kirsten from WhatCulture, and these are 9 outlandish conspiracies that were actually true. Number 9. Watergate. Duh. You've got to start with the obvious, right? Especially considering that Richard Nixon, the person at the heart of it all, was as paranoid and crazy as the people who imagined such conspiracies to exist in the first place. Nixon was a nervous wreck for the majority of his tenure in the White House, trusting nobody and keeping a series of tape recorders in the Oval Office which secretly kept note of every single conversation he ever had, just in case somebody tried to blackmail him, or somebody needed blackmailing. Nixon wasn't lax when it came to underhanded deeds. Even before he took the presidency, his predecessor, Lyndon Johnson, recalled seeing Nixon sabotage peace talks with Vietnam, which kept the war raging for years. It was when he took the place of Commander-in-Chief that Tricky Dicky really hit his stride though, with all of this paranoia and distrust of even his own cabinet leading to the Watergate scandal, uncovered by 2 Washington Post journalists and adapted into the really rather good film All the President's Men, and equally good, albeit quite boring, The Post. In a nutshell, the Watergate scandal began bad enough, Nixon paying people to break into the headquarters of his Democratic rivals to place bugs, and grew into a full-blown conspiracy as it transpired how many people were in on the president's underhanded, not to mention illegal, tactics, with everyone from senators to members of the IRS being harassed by his people to keep stum. A huge conspiracy that took in half of Washington DC, and it was orchestrated by the president himself. And it actually happened. Scary. Number 8. General Motors destroy public transport. In the end, the Watergate conspiracy was destructive only to Nixon's political career, as he was swiftly impeached and discredited. If you want some real lasting effects from a conspiracy, you need to look into the commercial sector. General Motors is still being fingered as part of a conspiracy theory today, albeit as a victim. The 2006 documentary Who Killed the Electric Car suggests that GM's prototype vehicle, with zero emissions or need for petrol, was quashed by a lobby of big oil companies and the US government itself. Back in the day though, it was General Motors themselves who were behind the dodgy dealings, and they're confirmed too. Do you ever wonder why San Francisco and New Orleans are the only major American cities to have adopted trams and keeps them running to this day, whilst everywhere else has to contend with grubby buses or subways for public transport? Well, that's GM's fault. Between 1936 and 1950, the company joined up with a bunch of other burgeoning automobile manufacturers to form National City Lines and Pacific City Lines. The express purpose of that company? To buy up all the streetcars in the country and junk them, so people would keep buying cars to travel instead. During those 2 decades, National City Lines and Pacific City Lines took control of over 100 tram lines in LA, New York, and San Diego, replacing them instead with bus routes. You know, public transport that was powered by automobile engines, not electricity. If this all sounds familiar, that's because it's the plot of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And if you're shocked that there's even a note of realism in that film, well, you're not the only one. So there you go. Big Auto killed public transport in America by buying it all and then junking it all. Number 7. The CIA funded abstract art to take down communism. There was a long-seated joke, rumour or urban legend, depending on who was telling the story, in the modern art world that the CIA had secretly funded the careers of abstract artists like Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell and Mark Rothko, hoping that this expression of creativity and freedom from US artists would act as propaganda against the strict policies for artwork in the Soviet Union under communist rule. Then it turned out that it wasn't a joke, rumour or urban legend. It was a thing that actually happened. Despite the majority of the presidents during the period showing an active dislike for the expressionist abstract, maybe a neat double bluff, during the 50s and 60s the CIA fostered many anti-communist creative ventures, including the animated film version of Animal Farm. Their master stroke was in funding the careers of artists like Rothko, although many of these abstract types had communist sympathies themselves. The intelligence agency thought it prudent and effective to recontextualize their work as the sort that made America great, in comparison to those censoring Philistines in the East. It took until 1995 for a former agent to reveal the scheme, explaining that at the time the CIA was mainly staffed by Harvard and Yale graduates with liberal leanings when it came to books, music and culture. Under the name the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA secretly bought and toured artwork by abstract expressionists, proving that the USA was a sophisticated, culturally rich democracy, with your tax dollars and unbeknownst to the painters earning them. Number 6. Charles II and Louis XIV secretly bringing back Roman Catholicism. Boy, did that Charles II live a life. The rightful heir to the throne, overthrown by Oliver Cromwell and forced to live in exile in France for decades, only to return to power once the traitor popped his clogs a few years later. Quite the rollercoaster of emotions and cross-country boat rides Charlie had to endure. After he'd gotten the crown jewels firmly affixed to his bonds again in 1660, the king had perhaps gotten a little complacent after all the excitement he'd been through over the past couple of decades. So in 1670, he thought he'd indulge in a bit of political conspiracy. Hitting up his French pal King Louis XIV, no relation, Charles sought to make a secret pact that would be legally binding, but also nobody was ever to know about it, which we think is pretty much the definition of a conspiracy, especially since it pertained to the inhabitants of each king's respective country. The Secret Treaty of Dover, as it was colourfully named, promised that Charles would support French policy in Europe and in return he would get a lot of money, so he wouldn't have to subsist solely on Parliament. As a matter of fact, there were two treaties, a formal and public one concerning an Anglo-French military and naval alliance, and the secret one where Charles got a load of money and was also supposed to ensure that England would convert to Roman Catholicism, which never actually happened, but it wasn't for lack of trying, and was a pretty ballsy move for a guy who'd been deposed not 20 years before. Number 5. Naughty Ronald Reagan and the Iran-Contra affair. Well, that was a fun jaunt across to mainland Europe, but now it's back to the general awfulness, backstabbing and Machiavellian world of American political history that allowed George R.R. Martin to make serious bank by just dressing all that up in fantasy drag and calling it Game of Thrones. Not to be outdone by Tricky Dicky, when Ronald Reagan took office in the 80s, he was intent to prove that he was just as awful a president as he was a Hollywood actor. The cherry on top of a period in office that saw him screw over poor people, screw over anybody who wasn't white, and get shot was the Iran-Contra affair. The Iran-Contra affair was such a clustercus of illicit activity.
Take 3.
The Iran-Contra affair was such a clustercus of illicit activities that it's bonkers that anybody thought that they could get away with it in the first place, let alone that they actually did get away with it for a good while. This secret arrangement was a culmination of two separate and totally illegal acts that the government got their hands dirty with. First, selling weapons to Iran, who were subject of an arms embargo at the time. Second, using the money from those sales to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Sounds simple enough, right? Not really, but bear with us, because it gets worse from there.
Besides helping the Contras in their fight against the Sandinista government, something which Congress had just passed a law strictly prohibiting, the sales of arms to Iran were supposed to secure the release of US hostages in the country, and maybe inure the country a little more to a Western way of thinking. The actual outcome of all of this conspiratorial covering up of thoroughly unconstitutional behaviour was that the Reagan administration had to fully disclose all details of their dealings, and a lot of people lost their jobs. Except the president, of course, who had a good sense not to keep a library full of tapes where he copped to his involvement. Number 4, the CIA tried to invent mind control with LSD. Project MKUltra is one of the strangest real-life conspiracies to ever take place, and considering we've already covered one where modern art brought down the USSR, sort of, that's saying something. Not that it'll take much to convince you, since the secret project is better known as the CIA's clandestine attempt to invent mind control. We hasten to remind you that this is a list of conspiracies that were actually true. Between the 50s and the 70s, multiple people signed off on this plan like it was a good idea. Not only that, but nobody flinched at highly illegal activity like experimenting on unconsenting American and Canadian citizens by dosing them with hallucinogenics, subjecting them to verbal and sexual abuse, isolation, and various forms of torture. Fun! MKUltra was a truly huge conspiracy, taking in 80 constitutions including hospitals, colleges and prisons, all of whom had to keep stum about the stuff that they were up to. Partly that was held by them not actually knowing what they were doing. The CIA set up the majority of these institutions as fronts, and whilst some cottoned on, for the most part the experimenter and their subjects had no idea what was going on or why. It took until 1975 for the experiments to become public knowledge, and what few documents relating to it that hadn't been destroyed by the CIA were declassified and released in 2001. As if that wasn't all bad enough, the project was partly come up with by German scientists who had been hired by the US government after the end of World War II. So for 20 years, the CIA was secretly trying to control the minds of its citizens with LSD under the auspices of Nazis. Yep. That happened. Number 3, the FBI screw everyone with CoIntel Pro. These conspiracies have gone all the way to the top, and when you've reached the top, where do you go? You spread out laterally and get involved in some shadowy dealings that not only operate at the highest levels of government, but every level of society and politics. Which is exactly what the FBI did between 1953 and 1971 with CoIntel Pro, short for Counterintelligence Program. A series of covert missions which aim to infiltrate, discredit and destroy political organisations according to the whims of Bureau head and nutter J. Edgar Hoover. Actually, CoIntel Pro tactics are still used by the FBI to this day, despite them being uniformly immoral and mostly illegal. These tactics include, but are by no means limited to, surveillance, psychological warfare, smear campaigns using forged documents, and by planting false reports in the media, harassment, wrongful imprisonment, and just straight up murdering folk who get in their way. This is not only a real-life conspiracy, but one that's still sorta active. It was between the 50s and 70s, around the same time as MKUltra, come to think of it, that CoIntel Pro was at its peak. In that time, the FBI secretly conspired against Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, almost every group that protested the war in Vietnam, the IRA, Albert Einstein, Ernest Hemingway, whose suicide was linked to his pressure at being under constant surveillance, and sometimes people who were bad, like the KKK. Initially, they sought to stamp out the communism that was supposedly spreading through the country, before dramatically expanding their scope. This was all done completely unbeknownst to the American people, and often under the direct order from the various presidents of the era. In fact, they'd been doing this sort of thing since the First World War, when the FBI were charged with rounding up and deporting radicals and anarchists, all totally covertly, with lots of people in on it. Chilling. Number 2, Masonic Lodge secretly control Italy. Now that we're all sufficiently jaded by the last 100 or so years of the American government's history and secret services, let's take a breather by casting an eye over to Italy, where the Illuminati actually exist. A mysterious cabal of high-powered individuals secretly guiding every political, cultural, and military event is a favourite of conspiracy theorists.
One of the most pervasive Illuminati-flavoured conspiracies is that Masonic secret societies, like Harvard's Skull and Bones Club, recruit the future secret rulers of the world. In Italy, that is 100% true. Or at least it was up until about 1981, when the group was revealed and finally dismantled. Propaganda Due was the name of the group, and it included prominent journalists, members of the parliament, industrialists, and military leaders. Initially operating semi-legitimately but secretly under the Italian government, they carried on regardless of their charter being withdrawn in 1976. This shadow government were the real people behind everything in Italian politics and society for 40 years, and in that time they had plenty of opportunities to get their hands dirty. Propaganda Due has been implicated in the collapse of the Vatican Bank in 1982, the murders of dozens of civilians, and nationwide cases of corruption. They also installed Silvio Berlusconi as Prime Minister, Vittorio Emanuele to the throne of Prince of Naples, and the heads of all three Italian intelligence agencies. Propaganda Due were in control of all facets of Italy and essentially ran the country, with many members of the government and the public at large being none the wiser, which, considering some of the stuff they got up to, is totally horrifying. Number 1. Scientology tried to take over the US government. Phew, how about we set our football on some good old American soil and reminisce about the time that the US government was almost overtaken by an insane cult who believe that they are descended from the souls of aliens who crashed their spaceship into a volcano during caveman times. Yeah, let's do that. And possibly inspire the ire of the Church of Scientology, who are infamously prickly when it comes to the unfavourable mentions of themselves in the media and official records. Which is why, during the 1970s, they engaged in a huge criminal conspiracy to infiltrate government agencies in order to dispel all the bad stuff people have been saying about them and their founder, L. Ron Hubbard, who wrote crappy sci-fi books. Operation Snow White, as they called it, was the single largest infiltration of United States government in history, involving 5,000 covert agents going undercover in 136 agencies, foreign embassies, and consulates. Not only that, but the church snuck into private companies who had been critical of Scientology and other entities in more than 30 countries. The church members stole documents, bugged government offices, and did lots of other totally illegal stuff. At first, the plan was just to wipe out details of things like the massive backdated tax the church owed to the IRS, but in the end took in governments across the world and even Interpol. They intended not only to seize documents relating to Scientology and their illegal activities, but also to plant false information to discredit the US government. It was basically CoIntel Pro, only enacted by a scary cult that's still trying to control things to this day. Once Operation Snow White was compromised, dozens of those involved were convicted of crimes and sentenced to prison terms. Since then, Scientologists have been reluctant to talk about the whole mess, when really they should be kind of proud. With the amount of agents they had and the sort of places that they were infiltrating, they could have very well taken over not just the United States, but the world. And then we'd all have to watch Mission Impossible 2 and say we liked it. And there we go, everyone. They are some of the most outlandish conspiracies that turned out to actually be true. What do you think are the weirdest conspiracies that you've ever heard? Leave us a comment down below and let us know. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. But for now, I have been Kirsten Ria, and I will see you in the next video.